Okay.
This meeting is being recorded.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Indian Energy Minerals Forum 2022 webinar series number 3 for our web series on water nexus. So this is presented and moderated by Steve Gray and Derek Watchman of the Sagebrush Hill Group. And this series will also feature 4 more webinars continuing the dialogue on tribal energy sovereignty. However, today we are focusing on water. So for those who are not familiar with me, I'm Michelle Littlefield. I'm a program coordinator with the United States Energy Association's Consensus Program. Just a little note about our program. We are formally named Building Consensus on Carbon Capture, Utilization, and Storage, CCUS. We call this Consensus for short. So this is a cooperative agreement with the Department of Energy, Fossil Energy, and Carbon Management. This program seeks to educate the public, policymakers, industry, and stakeholders on CCUS and carbon management related technologies. We do this by hosting webinars, a series of monthly educational briefings, workshops, conferences, technical reports, and our bi-monthly news clips. Sorry, one moment. At the end of this session, we will have a Q&A question and answer portion. This will be after each speaker and also towards the very end. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions, and we'll be addressing as many as we can. So this webinar will also be recorded and available to see on our webpage as well as YouTube, and we'll also have our presentation slides. But we do appreciate you taking the time to join us in person. So with that, I'll pass it on to Mrs. Sheila Hollis, our Acting Executive Director at USEA.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It's a real pleasure and honor to join this distinguished group. We are here on behalf of the USEA, but also working closely with DOE and the Fossil Energy Office in DOE. And it is a joy, really, to be presenting this very detailed, very useful, and very engaged program. I would like to thank particularly Derek, Steve, Ted, and also Alex and Steve, and Michael Moore, too, who has contributed tremendously to this effort. A little bit about USEA, for those who are not familiar with us. We've been around nearly 100 years, work in 104 countries, all hand in hand with the US government, DOE, USAID, and the State Department to improve the lot of the world, and also to inform, to teach, to improve safety, security, cybersecurity in countries around the world with which we work. We also have a board that's comprised of the major trade associations and the national labs, and meet regularly to present programs, but also to work up our initiatives for the following years. So with that, I just would like to say thank you so much, Michelle, for doing your hard work, and to Alex Croca, and to Michael Moore, and to our wonderful leaders and speakers here today. Thank you so much, and I will now turn it back to you, Michelle.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sheila. So with that, I'll also pass it on to Derek Watchman and Steve Gray of Sagebrush Hill to get us started. Derek, you on mute.
Okay, still can get it. Thank you, Michelle, for the heads up, and thank you, Sheila, for the introduction. It's our pleasure to be here and host this program. I'm Derek Watchman, president and owner of Sagebrush Hill Group LLC, and my partner and I, Steve Gray, who introduced himself in a minute here. We're pleased to be a part of the program, and we want to appreciate and send our appreciation to the Department of Energy's Fossil Energy and Carbon Management Program and USEA for engaging in what we call some discussions regarding tribal energy development. And we think that this is a very, very important concept and effort to figure out how to discuss it and how to look at energy development. I've been involved in energy for many, many years along with Steve, and it's been my goal to see meaningful, sensitive, balanced, but productive energy development across the Indian country. And I know that at this point, we're engaging in some meaningful changes. We're moving toward carbon reduction, net zero. A lot of tribes that we know of are heavily financed and heavily dependent on fossil energy. And so the big question for myself and Steve is, how do we move that pendulum so that tribes obviously can continue to provide revenues for their people, their government, but also in a sustainable and environmental way, move to more meaningful energy production, particularly on their reservations, because a lot of tribes are so dependent on energy. Gaming hasn't been, kind of the windfall for many of the rural tribes. And so it's our pleasure to be here today. And we have a great program for everybody. But before we get into the program, I'd like to turn the time over to Steve Gray, my partner in this project. So Steve, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Derek. And thank you, Sheila, and others that are joining us today. We're very pleased to be talking about this subject, what we call the water energy nexus. It's very important, and we feel it's extremely important to tribes and to their members. And the reason we say that is, when you talk about energy production, you can't do it without water. Just like people can't live without water. So we've known its many uses, to do energy production. Most people are very familiar, with power generation as an example. But there's a lot more to that. And so it's very important that we start to open up that discussion about this relationship between, water and energy. And specifically as we talk about tribes, because they have always had a relationship with this sacred element of water as being part of life. So it's very important that we be able to view this discussion as a whole and start to look at it, on how water energy policies jointly, how they affect everyone, particularly in tribes. And as we look at things like climate change, and as we look at national security, we all know that water has become very critical in those discussions. And so we're very pleased today to have our speakers join us and share their views of what they see. We have a feeling that the water energy nexus discussion will be one topic that will continue on down the road, because it's just so critical to everyone. And when we talk about economic development, you have to talk about water as well, as just like you talk about energy when you talk about economic development. So with that, we're very pleased and to bring the speakers here with us today. So with that, I'll turn that back over to Derek. Derek.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Before we get into our speakers, I'll turn the time over to Mike Moore, who's been our partner with USEA. So Mike, we're welcome and look forward to your words. So the floor is yours, Mike.
Make it quick and short. Michael Moore, Program Director at USEA, and Derek and Steve, it's really great to have you with us and have this program that you've been able to put together and the attention that you get with it. Great contribution to folks that need to have more insights, and I'm going to leave it at that. You've got a lot of great content in front of you, so off and running, and thank you.
Thank you, Mike. We appreciate it. Let's move the time over to Mr. Stanley Pollock, retired attorney, spent many years with the Navajo Nation as their primary legal attorney advisor. And so Stanley, I go way back. And so Stanley, welcome. I appreciate you joining us. And I know you're busy doing all kinds of wonderful things, but thank you. And I'd like for you to tell us about your experience and what you think is critical for tribal development, particularly in energy as it relates to water, because you have a long history. So welcome Stanley, and I'll turn it over to you.
Hey, thank you, Derek. Good morning. Let me see if I can figure out how to share the screen here. So we all know that there's a huge nexus between energy development and the need and use for water. And I've been more involved with the Navajo Nation in terms of water rights issues, quantification of water, enforcing water rights and whatnot. So I'm going to really not talk so much about energy per se and its use of water, but I'd like to talk about how the fact that energy development, which can otherwise have adverse impacts on the environment, can actually be beneficial in certain senses with respect to the development of a water rights strategy. And so I'd briefly like to address that issue. I start off with this iconic painting by Norman Rockwell about the construction of Glen Canyon Dam adjacent to the Navajo Reservation on the Colorado River. And it basically symbolizes, the development of the West, the development of energy, the development of water infrastructure, where Navajos largely got left behind. But so let me talk about just in general terms. What I'd like to discuss are really three basic ideas. One is the role of energy in the quantification of Indian water rights, something that I've been involved in quite heavily since 1985. The second being the role of energy in the implementation of Indian water rights. So it's one thing to be filing lawsuits like I've done concerning the quantification of water rights. It's a whole other thing to actually implement the use of the water rights that are obtained either through negotiated settlements or through litigation. And then lastly, I'd like to just touch on the Navajo Nation's experience in terms of energy and water development, and just briefly talk about a few case studies here. So let's talk about first the role of energy in the quantification of Indian water rights. When we quantify water rights for tribes, we start with the seminal case of Winters versus the United States, which held that water is impliedly reserved to tribes for the purpose to carry out their reservation. And I'm sorry, to carry out the purposes of the reservation. So in the Winters case, water was being diverted by non-Indians upstream of the Fort Belknap Reservation in Montana. Tribes had not put water to use extensively, and the United States brought an action to enjoin the upstream diversions of water because it was going to impair future uses by the tribes on their reservation. The Supreme Court said that even though the tribes hadn't put the water to beneficial use at the time the reservation was created, that the United States had impliedly reserved the water necessary to develop the reservation. So that was in 1908, and we're still sort of arguing about the methods for quantifying what it means to say, what is the water reserved to a tribe to carry out the purpose of the reservation. And that's something I've been involved in litigation since 1985, and I recently retired from that last year. So I'll just share with you what I know. What's really important when we talk about the purpose of a reservation is that reservations are intended to be permanent homelands for Indian people, and water would be necessary to fulfill the purpose of an Indian homeland. Now, as I said, the quantification standards had always been rather unclear, and despite the fact that Winters was decided in 1908, it wasn't until 1963 that the Supreme Court articulated a standard of practically irrigable acreage, where they said the only feasible and fair way by which the reserved water for the reservations can be measured is irrigable acreage. Now let's think about what they're doing here. What the intent of the Supreme Court was to say, tribes were basically relocated or confined to much smaller areas than they had historically enjoyed. And so for example, in the case of the Navajo Nation, they occupied vast quantities of land and were confined to a much smaller reservation through the 1868 treaty. the idea in the treaty was that that Navajos would become farmers and pursue agrarian pursuits. So if you look at the treaties that were enacted in the mid-19th century, they all have agriculture as the predominant purpose of the reservation. So the idea was basically that the tribal members should become farmers. They should be farming their land as opposed to using their land in much more expansive ways. And so agriculture was always an intent in the treaty making. And so what they said in Arizona versus California was to measure the water necessary for the permanent homeland, we will quantify the amount of water you would need to put into effect all of the practicably irrigable acreage on your reservation. And without getting into that standard too much, it's a practicality standard. You have to show that you have the soils, that you have engineering feasibility, that you could actually have a positive investment if you were to put the water to beneficial use in agriculture. This is a map of the Navajo Reservation in the Four Corners area showing you irrigable lands on the reservations. So not all the lands that are on reservation lands are prone to irrigable acreage, but this just gives you an idea that it's not the entire reservation that can be practically irrigable. And we'll get into this a little later, when you look at the western portion of the Navajo Nation there, you'll see there's a sort of a lack of green spots, a lack of arable land. Now the problem, the problem is that not all the acreage can be irrigated, and certain areas are very difficult to sustain irrigation. And so when we were quantifying water rights in Arizona, the Arizona Supreme Court said that practicably irrigable acreage isn't the sole basis for quantifying water rights. Water is necessary to carry out its purpose as a permanent homeland. Now, in the case of the Navajo Nation, for better or for worse, has largely been an energy colony. It's blessed not so much with vast quantities of irrigable acreage, but it's blessed with, again, for better or for worse, huge amount of mineral deposits in terms of oil, gas, and coal. So in our efforts to quantify water rights on the Navajo Nation, we have looked to energy development as an important component in that quantification process. So if we look at the three basic uses that one could put water to use in a permanent homeland, the first would be for agriculture, and that's based on the practically irrigable acreage standard. But again, not all lands are susceptible to irrigation. Then you also talk about water that's necessary for domestic municipal needs, which as compared to agriculture isn't very much. So we look to industrial uses that could be necessary for the permanent homeland, for example, energy. Now here's a picture of the Colorado River next to the Navajo Reservation. You see the Colorado River makes the western boundary of the Navajo Nation. So if you imagine you're trying to put together a claim where you're saying the Navajo Nation is entitled to water from that river for irrigation, you can imagine the challenge of trying to lift water out of the Grand Canyon several thousand feet up onto lands that at best are probably marginal for agriculture. So the way we've developed water rights claims is basically not to talk in terms of practicably irrigable acreage to the exclusion of other quantifications, but in my view, the nation has practicably developable mineral resources that can be converted into energy. So in the absence of practically irrigable acreage, mineral resources should be considered a surrogate for irrigable acreage, and practicable energy development is akin essentially to practicably irrigable acreage. So again, looking at Navajo claims to the Colorado River, they would be very, very challenging if they were limited to agricultural uses because of the tremendous cost it would take to lift water out of the Grand Canyon. But if you can put water to a higher use, a use that returns greater dollars for the investment, such as energy development, you can see that being able to develop energy, it would be a good strategy for trying to maximize your water claims. So in addition to the role that water could play in terms of enhancing your or a tribe's water rights claims, energy can also play an important component in the implementation of Indian water rights. So once you've obtained water right for a tribe, whether it's through a negotiated settlement or through a litigated decree, energy can play a really important role. The first role it can play is, well, what tribes spend decades going to court or in settlement negotiations to get their water rights. And what are they left with at the end of the day? They end up with a paper water right that has use perhaps in the future, but it doesn't necessarily bring them a benefit unless you can somehow develop that water right. So energy development becomes a valuable asset in terms of being able to monetize water rights that tribes have obtained. Whether the water right is for agriculture, drinking water, or industrial purposes, the Supreme Court has said you can use it for any purpose on the reservation. So in essence, even if you obtained a large decree of water for an agricultural purpose, you could still develop energy using that water right. So energy development can be valuable in terms of monetizing those water rights, putting paper water rights to wet water uses. In addition, water can be beneficially used for energy development while tribes grow into their future, their water supply, and for other purposes. So here, what I'm talking about is, if I'm litigating a claim for the tribe, and I'm saying in the future, the tribe is going to need X amount of water to meet its future population needs, its future economic development goals, those goals may not be reached for a very, very long time. And so even if the goal is to put all the water to use for agriculture, or to put all the water to use for municipal or light industrial development, commercial development, tribes may not have the means to do that immediately. And certainly when we're talking about drinking water for populations will grow in the future. The point being, there will be a time period between when tribes get their water rights and when they can put it to beneficial use. And I see energy as playing a very critical role in terms of being able to bridge the water rights that tribes can get through negotiated settlements or court decrees and their ultimate use of water. So I'm sorry that the problem is that unused tribal water is often used or relied on by entities, and they will continue to rely on those water supplies claimed and reserved and needed for by tribes. So here's a picture of the Central Arizona aqueduct off the Colorado River. It's the position of the Navajo Nation, and the Navajo Nation is in litigation right now, suing the United States for the way it's managed the Colorado River without taking into account the needs of the Navajo Nation, the future water demands of the Navajo Nation. So basically, the nation is claiming that water is essentially going to Central Arizona that the Navajo Nation will need in the future. And these communities in Central Arizona are relying on that water supply. That's something that causes great concern for the Navajo Nation. Unused tribal water can be put to use by others. They rely on it. They develop institutional reliance. It becomes very, very difficult to get the water back. If you can put that water to use in the development of energy, you have a way to tie up that supply until the tribe is able to put the water to beneficial use on its reservation. Now, you may have heard that a lot of tribes are involved in and interested in water marketing. And water marketing is a way for tribes, again, to monetize the value of their water rights when they're not putting it to use. But the problem is that most water marketing involves leases to non-Indian communities, and those non-Indian communities are not going to go away. So even if the lease is for 100 years, that community is still going to be around in 100 years' time and can put political pressure on the tribe in order to keep that water supply. So in my view, the better path than water marketing is to put water to development on energy projects, which aren't necessarily around for hundreds of years. And in the case of the Navajo Nation, which we'll get into in a couple of minutes, we have power plants, we have coal mining. Those are not perpetual uses of water for energy. Coal mines have a finite capacity. Power plants have a finite capacity. Unlike cities, which don't go away, energy development is for a much more finite period of time. So in my view, energy development is a useful tool for tribes to use to put their water to use until they're able to fully use the water on their reservation and to monetize the benefits. So let's talk briefly about the experiences of the Navajo Nation. I'm going to start with perhaps the most controversial one, which is the Navajo Generating Station, which is located just off of Lake Powell on the Colorado River, outside the city of Page on the Navajo Reservation. So in 1969, the Navajo Nation Council approved the development of the Navajo Generating Station on the Navajo Reservation. In so doing, they agreed that out of Arizona's upper basin Colorado River apportionment of 50,000, the generation station could use up to 34,100 acre feet of water a year. The historic use there has been about 28,000 acre feet of water. So what happened in the late 60s is that the developers recognized that the water that they needed for the power plant was most likely water that the Navajo Nation would have a very strong claim to. And so they insisted that the Navajo Nation Council formally agree to allow the power plant to use up to 34,100 acre feet of water a year for the development of the Navajo Generating Station. Now, this is something that hasn't come without controversy. A lot of people have questioned the Navajo Generation Station deal, saying that the Navajo Nation's not receiving money or payment for its water supply, but what the Navajo Nation is receiving is economic development on its reservation. Some of the best paying jobs on the Navajo Nation are at the Navajo Generating Station. And certainly the Navajo Generating Station relies on coal that is produced on the Navajo Nation. Excuse me. Going back to the idea that energy development can help strengthen your water rights claims, I look at the Navajo Generation Station as a classic example. So the Navajo water rights claims in the upper basin have been unquantified. They remain out there, and where the nation is currently in negotiation with the United States and the state of Arizona. The nation would claim an historic use of 28,000 acre feet of water, which was the historic use by the Navajo Generating Station. And when it comes to proving water rights in litigation, your strongest case is always going to be water that has been put to beneficial use, as opposed to practically irrigable acreage, where you are trying to convince the court that water that hasn't been put to use could be put to some beneficial use and be done in an economic fashion. The Navajo Nation can claim here that water has been put to practicable use in the energy development since 1969. And so they have a very, very, very strong claim to the 28,000 acre feet of water that was historically used at the Navajo Generation Station. Now, unfortunately, the state of Arizona seeks to use this water for other purposes, making the negotiation, the possibility of a negotiated settlement very, very difficult. And it wants to get some of that water back. But in my view, that's unheard of. It's a basic tenet of Western water law that once water is put to beneficial use, that water vests with the user. And in this case, the water was used on the Navajo Nation at a lease given by the Navajo Nation at a power plant that was authorized by the Navajo Nation. That's a Navajo use. So I think the Navajo Nation has a very, very strong claim to the Navajo Generating Station water. The Navajo Generating Station closed production a couple of years ago. And so the only water that's being currently used there is for reclamation purposes. And so that's why everyone has been very, very actively involved in trying to negotiate where that water is going to go. Now, I mentioned that the Navajo generating station is fed by Peabody Coal Company. So here again, there's a water energy nexus. So water is used at the Peabody mine in the production of coal, largely for dust suppression purposes. But in the case of Peabody, the Peabody Coal Company supplies coal not only to the Navajo generating station on the reservation, but to the Mojave generation station, which is about 270 miles away, located in Nevada. That coal was fed by a slurry pipeline, which is shown in this map here, from Black Mesa in the middle of the Navajo Reservation down to the Mojave Power Plant in Laughlin, Nevada. And so that the slurry operation was using about 4,000 acre feet of pristine groundwater a year for its mining operation. Now, what's interesting to me is that the opponents of the use of the water for the slurry line, they were saying that, well, this water could be put to much more beneficial uses on the Navajo Nation, such as for agriculture. So 4,000 acre feet of water, maybe you can get 1,000 acres of irrigation out of it. But think about the economic powerhouse that this water energy nexus provided. The water for the slurry line not only kept the mine operational, which was bringing in, say, $35–50 million of revenue a year in terms of taxes and royalties. It also was employing hundreds of Navajos with good paying jobs, and the water was being sold to Peabody for about 1,200 acre feet a gallon. So I'm sorry, $12,000 an acre foot. So it was being largely sold to Peabody at a very, very high rate. So it was quite an economic engine. The power plant shut down in 2006, largely because of the controversy of using groundwater to slurry the coal. But in any event, there is this water coal nexus, and the impact of the pumping on the aquifer has long been debated by folks at Navajo, both pro and con. So that's water that was used. It's not used anymore for coal transportation, and the water levels in the wells are beginning to rebound from once the slurry line was shut down. The last experience that I wanted to talk about in terms of power plants was the failed Desert Rock project, which was proposed back around 2003, I believe. And Desert Rock, again, the Navajo Nation is blessed with an unusual amount of minerals that can be developed and turned into energy. And Desert Rock was going to use state-of-the-art pollution abatement technology, the so-called clean coal technology. At the same time the Desert Rock was proposed, the nation was trying to settle its water rights in the San Juan River Basin. And so the Desert Rock power plant would have needed a certain amount of water. The Navajo Nation was trying, as part of that settlement, to get the Navajo Gallup project, which is shown in this illustration on the slide here. They're trying to get water from the San Juan River down to service communities in northwest New Mexico, where Navajos are largely hauling water. So the Navajo Gallup pipeline ended up being included as part of the Navajo New Mexico water rights settlement. But the Desert Rock project was opposed by the Obama administration and was dropped as a component of that project, of the Navajo Gallup water supply project, which is unfortunate for the project. It may be positive for the environment. It's unfortunate for the project because when you're building a large scale municipal water project, the largest cost that you have to keep that project going is your energy costs. It's very, very expensive to move water. If you can have a large industrial water user, such as a power plant or an energy source that can help defray the costs of your operation, maintenance, and replacement costs, that's very, very beneficial. So we have a pipeline that's being built, highly successful. The Desert Rock project was never developed. And now the Navajo Nation is struggling, trying to find ways to pay the OM&R costs of the Navajo Gallup pipeline. And I would submit that if Desert Rock had moved forward, they would have had a ready source of revenue to help pay for that project, help pay for the water project. And what has happened at Navajo is that coal mining is dead. People have opposed coal mining. They don't want to see coal mining anymore. They don't want to see water used for coal mining. So these projects are no longer viable. Now, what is being developed or is in the process of being developed is possible hydropumped storage. Hydropumped storage is where you take water and you pump it up into an upper reservoir to store it and release it during those periods when you can generate electricity at a much higher rate than you're paying for the electricity to get pumped up there in the first place. So hydropower storage is seen as a tool which can largely help the development of renewable resources on reservations and elsewhere. The idea being that most renewable resources, when they produce energy, they don't have the ability to store the power that they produce in any meaningful way. So if you can put that energy to use by pumping water to a higher elevation and then releasing it to generate electricity during peak electrical demands, you have a source of supply of water that can help you generate storage for renewables. These projects don't come without environmental costs as well. There was proposals to dam the Little Colorado River, which is tributary to the Grand Canyon, or to the Colorado River in the Grand Canyon. These are projects that I filed motions to intervene in opposition to them because of the severe environmental consequences and the severe consequences on Navajo cultural resources. But there are other hydropumped storage projects that make quite a bit of sense. For example, the Daybreak Energy Project would take water out of Lake Powell, an existing reservoir, pump it to a reservoir to be built up in Utah, and then that water could be released and generate electricity. So it's a way of, again, monetizing water. The Navajo Nation just recently obtained a water rights settlement with the state of Utah. This would be a way of utilizing part of those water supplies that it obtained in the settlement and monetizing them. So whatever your views are on energy production, the Navajo Nation has had quite a history of energy production, some for the better, some for the worse. And I'm hopeful that with pumped hydro storage, if it's done in an environmentally responsible manner, could be a really viable way of putting water to beneficial use for the Navajo Nation, and become a very viable way of promoting the development of renewable energy resources on the nation. So with that, I'll turn it over to the rest of the panel.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Pollock, Stanley. That was very informative and good information again for for our viewers to see the complexity of the water nexus. With that, we would like to move right on down to our next presenter. We're very pleased today to have from Los Alamos National Laboratory, a gentleman that has been involved in energy development, but also involved in running one of their applied energy programs there at Los Alamos National Laboratory. And so we're very pleased today that Dr. George Guthrie, the Deputy Program Manager there, was able to join us and to share his view of what he is seeing as we move down this water nexus from their view, which also includes also the work that they do for the Department of Energy. So with that, Dr. Guthrie.
Yeah, thanks very much for that introduction, Steve, and thanks to you and Derek for inviting me, and to the USEA as well. Let me get my slides up here. And just do a quick check. Steve, are you able to see a single slide?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So so what I'd like to talk about is building up what we heard in the last presentation of how energy and water, some of the issues that we wrestle with energy and water today, and really look towards the future, and how is energy, how is the energy water nexus going to factor in to the transition of energy systems as we move forward. I'm going to set the stage a little bit by looking generally at energy transition at the national scale, and then I'm going to really focus in on the Intermountain West, which is what we've been trying to take a look at. We heard earlier from Steve the importance of water in the context of energy and economics and its tie to climate change. And those three pieces come together in spades in the Intermountain region. We're in a region where we're already stressed for water. It's projected to get even more challenging in this region. We're already being impacted by transition of energy systems. And so what we're doing in this initiative, I'll tell you about the Iwest Initiative, is looking at options for the region on transition pathways that are appropriate for the region, that take into consideration the importance of water and other regional factors, and looking for strategies on how we can move forward and preserve both jobs and economic jobs and revenue. I'll tell you a little bit about the Iwest Initiative, then I'll focus in specifically on water in the Intermountain West. And at the end, I'll come back to just a slide reminding you about the Iwest Initiative and some other ways you might be able to get engaged. You can see my email up here in the upper left, geo@atlanta.gov. So if you have any questions or comments, I'd certainly welcome those. Okay, so let me just tee up the topic of energy transition. And what we see on the left here is a graph of essentially the US energy system, and it's shown in the context and the growth of the carbon dioxide emissions over the last century. And in underpinning that, of course, is our build out and development of a large number of fossil resources that we depend on very heavily for our energy system. There's a couple of takeaways that I want you to get from this. One of those is shown by the orange curve, and that orange curve is essentially a curve that takes us from where we are currently from carbon dioxide emissions to zero. Right now I'm showing that at 2050, which is a curve that has been targeted both globally and nationally as in terms of a goal of getting to carbon neutrality. What's important to take away from this is if you look at the slope of that curve and how steep it is relative to the slope you see over the last century, what you realize is that the change we're proposing for our energy systems is going to have to happen at a much faster rate than has happened over the last century. We've had a gradual build out of our energy systems, and now we're at a place where we're proposing to change those in a very short period of time. And that's going to be challenging. And challenging for a number of reasons, from technology and resources standpoint, from its impact on water. It's also going to be challenging because we have communities that have evolved in response to that gradual change, that gradual development. And so we want to do that transition in a way that avoids disruption to these communities. The other takeaway from this is that is getting back to the theme of our webinar today, and that is energy and water. And if we think about the water needs and energy transition, we've heard a little bit about the water needs as we've gotten up to this point. What I want to think about is the water that we're talking about in energy transition, some of the technologies that are being proposed to meet this transition goal, and thinking about how water plays into that. And there's been a lot of discussion about that because, as we've heard, energy production takes water. And the question I really want to explore is, how much water are we talking about for this transition, and how does that compare with other water needs that we have within the region? There's also another piece of this that I'll come back to at the end, which is an opportunity, and that is that energy is also tied to water in the sense that energy can be used to process water. And there are a number of non-traditional water sources that we can look at, particularly in this Intermountain West region, that can become an opportunity, I think, that'll be very important for regions that are concerned about water use. That question at the bottom is one that we've been wrestling with. So how do we make this transition in a way that is both rapid and equitable? And DOE has also been wrestling with this. So DOE has focused a lot of effort on developing of the technologies that can help this transition occur, and thinking about this transition at the national scale. There's been a very big focus recently on trying to understand this transition in the context of regions, which is where transition will occur, and trying to understand the transition in the context of making it equitable. And so we're leading an effort in the Intermountain West for the Department of Energy, in particular the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, and really trying to focus on that green question. So let me tell you a little bit about that effort now. That effort is known as the Iwest Initiative, stands for Intermountain West Energy Sustainability and Transitions. And it really is trying to tackle that green question from the previous slide. It's looking at the 6 states you see on the left. And in the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit about why we're focused on those 6 states. In this first year, we're really focused on trying to frame out a roadmap on getting to carbon neutral in this region, thinking about some of the technologies that could be used that are regionally relevant, how those technologies map to concerns and opportunities and community needs within the region, one of which, of course, is water. And that approach of really thinking about transition in the context of what it means at the community level and the region level is something that's called place-based approach. And that's a very big focus right now in the Department of Energy. In addition to the technology bits, we're also trying to begin framing out some of the non-technology aspects that we need to understand, like a policy landscape in the region, revenue and jobs within the region, workforce, equity, energy, and environmental justice. You see at the bottom the organizations that have come together in this phase 1 of Iwest. It is a Department of Energy initiative. We have San Juan College, who is helping to understand a number of factors within the region, including workforce issues, and also trying to help us understand issues tied to sovereign nations within the region. And there are similar roles that for each of the other entities that you see down there. And really this team is not meant to be the comprehensive set of entities that need to come together. It's really the team that is helping to pull together the networks within the region that have to come together for this. And so this is really this team is the boots on the ground trying to do outreach. We have a website, iwest.org. It's got a lot of information on the effort if you have any interest there. And I encourage you to go to that. And there's also an email address you see, iwest@lanl.gov. And that is a place that you can send questions, comments, and concerns. So why do we focus on the 6 states that we see here? In the upper left, you can see a map that shows some blue coding that gives a sense of how much oil and gas revenue is embodied in each of the states in the region. And 3 of the states, Arizona, Colorado, and Wyoming, have a very heavy existing oil and gas economy, as does Utah to a somewhat lesser extent. On top of that, you see the counties that have been impacted and will be impacted by transition away from coal. So these are communities that depend very heavily on coal. And if you take those in total, one message that comes out is this region has depended very heavily on fossil energy. And as fossil energy begins to transition to other energy forms, there is a potential for very big impacts on that. And so one question is, how do we look at this region and do this transition in a way that is equitable? And one takeaway for this is that it turns out capturing of carbon dioxide is a very important piece of the transition. And that turns out to be a very important opportunity within the Intermountain West. There are a number of other factors, though, that besides the fossil economies that really help to unify this region in a way that is distinct from other regions in the country. And the middle map at the top is a very important one, and that is drought. And we know that the region is very impacted already by drought. Climate change is anticipated to make these droughts even more prevalent within the region. And so that, of course, makes water a very prominent concern within the region. I'm going to have a little bit more about that in the next slide. But before I get to that, I also wanted to just note that in this region, we have a number of rural communities, including sovereign nations. There are about 63 sovereign nations within the region, many of which depend on these existing fossil economies. And so if you take that top row in total and you think about just the geographic aspects of the region, there's some really important differences for this region compared with, for example, the Gulf Coast and New England. Let me look at the water bit and just throw this up to help tee up some of the other discussions. So this is coming from a national study looking at projected climate change within regions in the United States. And this is really looking out to the 2040 or 2060 timeframe. So what's going to happen over the next couple of decades as climate evolves? And the first key message that they have out there is targeting water in this region. And there's the theme that Steve started us off on: water for people and water for nature, very important in the Southwest. And it's been very tied to droughts. Intensification of these droughts and changes and increases in the temperature is forecast to be have a very profound impact on future surface water availability. Now it's uncertain at this point what the net impact is going to be in terms of infiltration in different parts of the region and runoff. But one thing that is certain to occur is a change in the winter nature of precipitation, going from snow to rain. And that does have a big impact on things like surface water, which is very important in the context of energy. Actually, I'm going to just go back to this slide again. And one of the recommendations you see at the bottom, the need for flexible water management techniques that address changing risks over time, and thinking about this balancing between declining supplies and greater demands. So that for us is a very important call to arms in the context of our energy transition plan. How does water factor into energy so that we have a plan that also takes into account the other demands on water resources? Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the energy pieces that we're looking at in the context of this transition, and they tie in part to what you see in the bottom row of maps up above, the fact that there's a lot of renewable resource within the region. Solar, wind, and geothermal are all very prominent within the region, and those provide an important route to a low carbon electricity economy, which you see in the lower left of that triangular diagram. There are three other pieces that we're looking at in addition to the low carbon electricity. We're looking at the CO2 economy. And what that is looking at a new economy that can be built around capturing carbon dioxide and then utilizing or storing that carbon dioxide. Very important part of getting to carbon neutral. And it could be a very important economy that has very strong ties to water within the region. There's the hydrogen economy that we've been hearing a lot about lately in the news. That's at the top of the diagram. And this economy is one based around the production of hydrogen and the utilization of hydrogen. This region has a number of ways that it can get to that economy, including producing hydrogen from methane resources in the region. That's called blue hydrogen, and producing hydrogen from renewable resources in the region. That's called green hydrogen. That's tied into the water economy as well. And finally, there's the bioenergy economy in the lower right, which is using a number of biological pathways to pull carbon dioxide out of the air and then produce products that can be used to produce new energy resources. So one example would be growth of algae and using those algae to produce alternative products to petroleum. So those are the 4 energy economies that we're looking at in the transition strategy. It's not to say that the existing economies aren't important in the transition. In fact, they are. But these 4 emerge as very important future economies that we need to understand how they will evolve in the context of energy transition over the next decade or 2. The other piece I wanted to talk about here is that I've talked about how each of these is tied to water. They're also tied to one another. And so they're known as symbiotic economies, which means that the hydrogen economy depends very much on the development of a CO2 economy, as one example. And so a strategy or a plan that understands how both of these will develop in tandem is very important. And when you think about that, then in the context of all 4 of these, you can understand how important it is to have a strategy to make sure everything is moving in tandem. All right, so now let's go back to the transition pathway and take that national look that I showed earlier and really telescope it down to the region. There's the path for this region. You can see we have to get from about 385 million tons a year down to 0. And important takeaway for you is that there isn't one single technology that will allow this to happen. And there are reasons for this that I'm not going to go into today. But again, the takeaway is we need a portfolio of options to be able to get down to 0. I've shown the ones that are regionally relevant, potentially on the as these wedges. I've shown the wedges as being equal in size, and one of the things we're doing in our Iwest effort is getting an understanding of how big individual wedges could be within the region. And it turns out some wedges are going to be more important than other wedges. All of those wedges have ties to water, and so now I want to introduce the concept of how we're currently using water in the region and how does that impact how we might think about which of those wedges are important and which of the wedges, what technologies are going to be important in the wedges. And so here we see data from the US Geological Survey on current water use within the region. And the overall region is shown with the pie chart at the left, for which I've blown up by a factor of 2 the smaller wedges that are not associated with irrigated agriculture. So you can see them a little bit more clearly. So the main takeaway from this is that not surprisingly, the primary use of water in this region, as in much of the West, is for irrigated agriculture. You can see the second biggest use is that orange wedge, which is the public water supply. The red wedge is the one that I want to focus on right now. And also perhaps a little bit of the brown wedge, which is mining. The red wedge is thermoelectric power. So this is water used directly in the production of energy currently. And you can get a sense of the size of that wedge relative to the size of the domestic water supply, relative to the supply or the public water supply, relative to the size of the irrigated agriculture. So when we talk about water needs in this region for energy, they are a much smaller fraction of what the total water needs are. So when it competes with these other pieces, just keeping in mind that you can see in the lower left there, 0.4 million acre feet per year, or about 400,000 acre feet per year, is what that red wedge looks like for the entire Intermountain West. So if you keep that number in mind, 400,000 acre feet per year, let's now look at some of the wedges that I showed in the previous, one of the previous slides. And these are some initial estimates, just looking at the question of how big could specific wedges be in an energy transition. So as an example, if you look at all of the cars and pickups within the region, and you ask the question, what if we were to transition all of those to hydrogen fuel cell cars? It's not saying that's what we should do, but it's just taking the limit of how big of a reduction in emissions could we get if we were to do that? And you see how big that wedge could be, that first green wedge. You see the one for trucks within the region, which is the lighter green wedge below it. And if we then ask the question, how much water would be needed for both of those wedges if we were going to produce hydrogen for these vehicles? And what you see is it's 300,000 acre feet per year if that production is done through conventional approaches to steam methane reforming. So this is the blue hydrogen piece. There are ways you can reduce that by new technologies that lower the water use in producing the hydrogen. But even if you just took today's use, you get a sense of how big that has to be. And the takeaway, of course, is 300,000. That's about 3/4 of what we currently use for thermoelectric power in the region. So clearly, we're not talking about something that's going to be a huge competition on the water uses, but it's in the same ballpark as what we currently use for electricity. We're going to be doing similar analysis to this for what if you looked at all of these vehicles being electric vehicles? What if you looked at all of these vehicles being biofuel-based vehicles? And in that, we'll get a sense of the water needs for these various pathways and how that affects our strategy for moving forward. Interestingly, if you look at the second bullet under converting vehicles to hydrogen, you see about a factor of 15% of the amount of water needs to go from a green hydrogen pathway. And so in addition to looking at how you can lower water needs for blue hydrogen, having a strategy that can lead to growth in green hydrogen, that's taking water and breaking it apart into hydrogen and oxygen, can also be a very big way to reduce water needs for going that pathway. We move down to the capturing CO2 and point sources. You need water to capture carbon dioxide, and it's been argued that it's too much water to do that within the region. And here's some numbers that give you a sense of whether that is too large or not. 200,000 acre feet per year if we were to capture all of the point source emissions within the region, recognizing that we might take some coal facilities and turn them to natural gas. We still have to capture the carbon dioxide. We might retrofit some facilities with carbon capture and storage, and their industrial point sources. All of those then, with current water-cooled technology, is about a 50% increase in what our current thermoelectric water needs are. That was 400,000 in the previous slide. So again, the takeaway here is it's a lot of water, but it's in the ballpark of how we currently use water for energy. On the bright side, in the same way that there are ways to get to lower water needs for hydrogen, there are technologies like air cooling that can reduce those water needs by 90%. And so you take both of these first two categories together, and what the picture that comes out of this is that if you look at the regionally relevant technologies we want to think about, given our water concerns in the region, there are technologies that will allow us to tailor what we need in the region to the constraints we have on water. The last bullet is one on an opportunity for the region, and that is looking at produced water. And I'll have another slide next on the produced water we currently have. But if we were to store that carbon dioxide underground using tax credits like 45Q, we will be pulling out brine associated with those reservoirs to help manage the pressure. And that brine forms a non-traditional source of water in the region that we would anticipate growing over the coming decades up to the level of about, again, 200,000 acre feet per year of water. So here's a non-traditional water resource that could essentially offset the water needs that we have up above if we can figure out how to clean that water up enough to use it in things like cooling. So there's some real opportunities that we can look at here in the Intermountain West. It's already starting. Here's the current produced water that comes out associated with oil and gas. You can see the number down there in the lower right, 400,000 acre feet per year already in the region. There's the 200,000 I talked about in the context of CO2 injection. So there's a vast water resource, some of which may not be usable because it is so salty or so filled with hydrocarbons. But there are new technologies that may be able to enable a very large part of this water to be converted from essentially a waste stream to a new opportunity for the region. So with that, I'm just going to bring it back to the Intermountain West. We are very focused on trying to understand water concerns in the context of energy transition. We really want to hear from stakeholders that have different perspectives on water. There's an upcoming workshop that you can see shown on the left. That's one way to get involved. And I encourage you, if you're interested, to look at that. We have a recent seminar on produced water by Mike Hightower, and that video is up on the iwest.org website. We are doing listening learning sessions. So essentially, we're very interested in hearing from, again, stakeholders, and we're willing to set up times just to hear thoughts and ideas and concerns. And so there's a way to schedule one of those on the iwest.org website. And finally, just again, the website or the email address is shown there at the bottom for any general inquiries or comments. And so with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'll hand it back to Steve and Derek.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Guthrie. We really appreciate that overview of what is all happening with you guys' effort there in the Iwest corridor. And obviously it is a slither of the western side of the country, but it gives people a chance to understand just where we are going with all that. So our last panelist that we have, and we're very pleased that he's able to join us. He's a colleague of both Derek and I. He's now associated as the Vice President of Corporate Social Responsibility, and he's affiliated with the Yakima Chief Hops. And so we're very pleased today to have Mr. Ted Strong join us and be able to share his view with us. So Mr. Strong, it's all yours. You're on mute, so unmute yourself. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Ted, there. There you go.
Okay, good morning. Let me just begin by saying that it's a contrast listening to scientists and lawyers and listening to our tribal elders, tribal cultural leaders, medicine men, the women who gather our foods, the hunters who hunt, fishermen who fish, and many of us who suffered through really poor court rulings, whether it's the district court, the appeals court, Supreme Courts, and their interpretations of what belongs to them versus what belongs to us. I know we are supposed to be the United States, but we are not united in the outlook on who owns the air, the water, the land, and the light. When we began our relationship with the United States, it was through a belonging to a divine creator. We didn't belong to the United States. We were not governed by a United States Constitution. We were not subject to state law or county law. We were not subject to zoning requirements that were enacted purely for economic tax purposes. We did everything in our power to maintain the life granted to us by a divine creator since the beginning of time. And that meant that we were holding on to our core religious culture values. And from that, there happened to evolve our economy. We are a food culture people. Food can only grow with water, land, light, and air. That's what we had in abundance. We did not have agriculture. We did not have cultivation on the scale that we see today. There may have been some, but it was really quite incidental to anything else. And when we look at what we try to define with our relationship with the United States government, we try to explain to them that we relied upon fishing and hunting at all of our usual and accustomed fishing stations and where our foods grew. We were a natural law-based tribal people. We migrated along with the seasons of the year. And we never took more from nature than what we needed to exist. So when the United States contrived things like practically irrigable acreage, we wondered why didn't they apply that to the Grand Coulee Dam, one of the largest water projects in our history. Grand Coulee Dam provided irrigation water to 600,000 acres of desert. It's not practical to try and irrigate that. It never had existed. The United States dreamed it up. They spent the equivalent of $2 billion building the Grand Coulee Dam. They have irrigation suction pumps that lift water about 300 feet from the Grand Coulee Dam reservoir up to the desert plains above. There was no fish passage built into the Grand Coulee Dam at all. And it began a water pollution that never stopped. And then that was followed by 7 other main stem dams. And these dams destroyed the natural habitat, and it created what is called management. Management is nothing more than the interference of humans into a natural order of whether it's biosystems, whether it's human life, or whatever it might be. And everything that is considered mitigation, anything that is considered beneficial, really is just trying to account for all of the human mistakes made in the development of the United States and the deprivation of human rights of indigenous peoples. In the Columbia River Basin, we have 12 tribes that have water rights. Those water rights are being adjudicated in jurisdictions that have no sense of tribal cultural history. They have no idea in the manner in which tribal religions and ceremonies and traditions, customs and practices are developed, and how we've managed to hold on to those since the beginning of time, despite the intrusions by the United States of America. So when we talk about things like social justice, we were deprived of our land, which is against the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution of the United States, because we were never paid for that property. It was said that we negotiated those through treaties. Some said it was by conquest. We were never conquered people. We agreed to a treaty. The Supremacy Clause of the United States Constitution says treaties are the supreme law of the land. That is, until the United States Supreme Court, another supremacy, decided otherwise. The Supreme Court is viewed very distrust manner by tribes because those are political appointments. And the kinds of ravages that came upon the dispossession of our lands, the polluting of our rivers where we lived peaceably, culturally, healthily, the kinds of pollution we saw come to our sunlight and the air, none of those things were ever compensated back to us. So when we talk about the relationship of tribal people with water, it goes back to how we were created. We were created with water. Here in the Northwest, there are talk about the glacial movements that came about during the Ice Age. We have stories culturally that match those stories. There were giant lakes, there were giant animals, birds and fish, and our tribal people are associated directly with those. And as a direct connection to those, we own that history. That history can never be surrendered by our people. But that's what Governor Stevens, in negotiating these treaties, demanded of our people. So our tribal leader says, how can we give away something that doesn't belong to us? It belongs to the Almighty God Creator. The United States government has its authority that is derived from the congressional powers bestowed upon its negotiators and various other jurisdictions. They don't go back further. When we talk about our religious rights, they're not guaranteed to us by the First Amendment of the Constitution. In fact, tribal religions were never covered fully until 1993, the American Indian Freedom of Religious Act. We were the last people, even though we're the first indigenous people on this land, to have our religious rights guaranteed. And still they were being challenged all the way up to 1999. So when we talk about water, we think of it as it helped us to evolve onto the surface of the earth. It gave us our identities. There are two main stem dams on the Columbia River. One is called Wanapum, which means river people. And the United States didn't realize that they were naming that after a very sacred band of people, Wanapum. Inchiwana is the name of the Columbia River. Wanapum are the river people. They named this dam, which destroyed our fishing cultural ceremonial rights, after these sacred bands of people. Peluspum, that's another tribal word that means where a man has a right to dip his net into the waters. Those are very sacred places, and it involves the recognition of the holiness of those lands and those waters. Those dams that were built, even using those names, created huge amounts of destruction to habitat. So we had 12 million salmon used to return up the Columbia River each year. That's been reduced down to 2 million. It required the United States government to enact the Endangered Species Act and to fund it and to enforce it. Then they blamed the tribes because the United States government had to pay for its poor management of its own resources. And each year, when they're trying to restore the salmon, they blame the tribes for that cost. But those main stem dams, the Grand Coulee Dam in 1938 cost $163 million, which is about $2 billion in today's money. Every dam thereafter was built using taxpayer money. And none of those took into account that the salmon would be killed, the trout would be killed, the sturgeon would be killed, eagles would be killed, bears, otters, lynx, coyotes, you go all the way down. Those are all religious icons of our people. So the United States Constitution says Congress shall make no laws regarding the establishment of religion, but it also means they'll make no laws disestablishing religion. But that's exactly what they have done to our people. And many wonder, why do tribes have little or no trust with the non-Indian people when it comes to developing water projects or any other projects on tribal lands? It's because of this dispossession. It's because of a loss of our identity. And now we have the struggle to exist. Our economies have been virtually destroyed. And in its place, as was mentioned in previous discussions, we were told to become agrarian. We had no idea how to farm. But if you read the Treaty of 1855 regarding the Yakima Nation and 4 other tribes in our region, it says the United States shall provide to said Indians a blacksmith shop, mules, plows, and 2 blacksmiths, so they could make this conversion. They never lived up to that promise. Never been anything like that built. They said, you have to learn the English language so you understand us. We're going to build you a school, have you a superintendent. We're going to have 3 teachers. We'll provide books and supplies. That was never done. So when you talk about trust, it's hard to trust people who don't keep their word, even based on a treaty, which is supposed to be the supreme law of the land. And we had the Yakima River Basin adjudication, quantifying water rights. Now, who in the world gave the state of Washington the right to adjudicate Yakima Nation water rights? They did it entirely on their own. They assumed jurisdiction. 42 people filed, or parties filed in the Yakima River Basin adjudication, representing thousands and thousands of citizens. The Yakima Nation Reservation is 1.2 million acres. The adjudication resulted in the award, if you will, of 128,000 acre feet to the Yakima Nation. I can't tell you the amount of rage that ensued that ruling. How can a 1.2 million acre reservation be entitled to 128,000 acre feet of water? And it took the Washington State Supreme Court to reverse that really poor ruling that came out of that adjudication process. So what I'm saying are things that they're not necessarily prohibitions against water or any other energy development on tribal lands. These are advisory things that non-tribal people need to be aware of before entertaining any kind of development project on a reservation. Now, these things that I'm talking about, they're all a matter of public record. The United States versus Oregon is a court case that went to the Supreme Court. United States versus Washington was also a United States Supreme Court. The case law in that determined that ambiguity is something where there cannot be words used like impliedly, supposedly. There has to be clarity. That Supreme Court ruling said ambiguity must be favored in the way that tribal people understood the treaties at the time of their signing. That's an important part. The other part of those rulings is that tribal water rights include the rights to have their salmon, their foods, their hunting, their fishing. Didn't say anything at all about agriculture, because those were our beneficial uses. We allowed the benefit of water, land, air, and light to create vital life sources. And that Yakima River flowed and it created eddies, streams, channels. It created the artesian wells that we have there. And it created a floodplain wherein all these animals existed. Now those animals are gone. And that was the disestablishment of our religious values. Water is a very important religious value to us. The land, the earth where our ancestors are buried, those are important parts of life. Life and death are inextricably entwined. The sunlight, where we have ceremonies about the sun, the air, the spirits, the wind, those are all part of our tribal culture. So it's not just where we can define something as a monetized value. It's something that we have to look at as existential. So I feel like some of the things that might be helpful, we've entered into MOUs that are really kind of not binding agreements on how to proceed with studies. We've also entered in MOAs that are more binding, but that takes communication. It takes some understanding. It takes friendship and trust. And those are things that can be helpful in creating avenues for developing on tribal lands and tribal reservations. So I just want to say thank you. I offer up this contrast, not in a way that creates obstacles, but helps you understand that if not viewed correctly, they will be seen as obstacles. And really, it's just our defense mechanisms to make sure that our sovereign voices are heard in the manner that the United States pledged that they would be in perpetuity. They said these promises will live as long as the sun shines, as long as the rivers flow. That's what the language says. So we intend to hold the United States accountable to that. So thank you, Steve. Thank you, Derek. Thank other panelists. Thank those who are listening. That's all. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mr. Strong. You know, the whole purpose of this discussion around Water Nexus is to look at every angle of issues around water as well as energy. So it's good. It's good to have a different perspective. So with that, I'll leave it. I'll turn it back over to Mr. Watchman. He'll go ahead and we have a couple of minutes left. And I think did you want to, well, I'll let you do it, Derek, on the questions, how you want to handle it.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. We do have a couple questions, and I think we'll see if we can try to get through it. But thank you, Mr. Strong. Great presentation. And as Steve said, you know, we're trying to balance and try to hear from all folks and all angles when it comes to water and energy. And so you bring an important perspective, culture, religion, and the whole fact of tribes being sovereign. So thank you for those great words. And so there's a question here, and maybe Dr. Gunther can answer this. The first question is, why doesn't the Iwest Initiative cover Idaho? And that's probably a real quick answer, but any reason why Idaho? Maybe they're in another group, but I think you gave a compelling argument as to the 6 states. But where does Idaho stand in the initiative, if you will?
Very good question. The short answer is that the initial set of 6 states were identified based on communities that were going to be impacted by fossil. And so there's very little impact from a fossil transition standpoint in Idaho. Having said that, we also recognize that Idaho is a really important part of the Intermountain West. So as we move forward, understanding how that fits in with this existing region is going to be very important for us. But the Idaho was not part of that because of the low fossil impact currently.
Okay, and then there's a next question to that is Iwest engaging OCED and NE on the Nature Project at Kimmerer, Wyoming? I don't know those acronyms, but maybe you do, George.
Yeah, so we have started the dialogue with both OCED and with NE. They've been part of briefings on the overall Iwest effort, and we're engaging them in discussions on topics that we need to look at as we move forward into the next phase.
Okay, great. And then the last question, and I'm not sure if we have anybody online here to answer, and that is, it says that in reference to the WAPA power allocation set forth by former Secretary of Energy Bill Richardson, DOE recognized the water input from tribes for hydropower. As a result, 40% of the tribe's power needs will be supplied by the WAPA system. And this occurred in the 90s and are still in effect today. And I think because of drought and lower water levels, I think some of the hydro projects are dialing down their electricity output. And so I haven't heard anything on that. I think it's part of the allocation of the Colorado River Storage Project. and tribes do have access to it. And so I'm not sure if that's come up in anybody on this call here. Maybe you, George, have some thought on that.
No, I don't have any specific
Okay.
detail on that. That's something I'll look into.
Okay, yes. I know that was a big issue and big program. And when I was the Tribal Energy Affairs Director under Secretary Bill Richardson, that was something that was a big accomplishment. It basically provided access to crisp power at a nominal rate, and it went to many tribes along the crisp storage system. And so I haven't heard anything, but that's something that we need to look into. And so let's see, do we have any more questions here? There's a question about when can we access the recording. That'll be available not too long after this. And so we appreciate that. And all the information here is recorded and information will be available online. And so I think we're at the bottom of our hour, but so I want to say thank you very much. And I certainly learned a lot today, especially in the three areas when it comes to water and litigation and in the science and the InterWest project. And then of course, the culture and religious aspects. And I want to thank Steve for pushing and raising this issue of water. It's obviously very important. And I want to thank George and Stan and Ted for taking your time in joining us. And so this is our second webinar series, and we have 4 more. And as we said earlier, through the efforts of the Department of Energy and the United States Energy Association, our task is to raise awareness and have hopefully candid discussion on the components related to energy development, particularly on reservations. And so I'm very wedded to this. I've been involved in energy for many, many years for the principal fact of economic development, job creation, and revenues for tribal governments to operate. And tribal governments just don't have, for example, our states and counties have tax bases, and they have, for the most part, a definite source of revenue. On the tribal side, it's a tougher challenge. And so, as Stan, Mr. Pauly pointed out, many tribes have benefited from the residuals of fossil fuel development royalties, for example. But our environment is changing, and we're having to look at new energy production. And so what that does is it brings new challenges to tribes when it comes to using their resources, particularly for energy development. So I want to thank everybody for joining us. And I'll turn it over to Steve and Mike for any closing comments, and then we can conclude this great webinar. So Steve, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Derek. And again, thank you, panelists and everyone that joined us today. We envisioned, we knew that Water Nexus would be a very good topic to cover, that there will be a lot of interest, and based on the texts and emails that we're getting, there is a lot of interest in it because it's very important. It's important to everyone, and everyone has a view about it. And so in order to be able to move it along, it's important that we continue that discussion. So one of the things we might do is look back and see if we need to do another webinar session, just particularly around the Water Nexus one. So we're very pleased, with it. As was mentioned earlier by Derek and others, the impact, the economic impact is very important to tribal people. We always keep that in mind, jobs and revenue are critical to them, and so we want to make sure that as we give advice and move things forward, that we're doing it in a very professional manner. And with that, we want to thank you all for joining us. So with that, we'll close out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Okay.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.